This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, John Rada back with episode 113 of A Geek Leader podcast, and today on the show we've got Tony Saldanha. He was a former CIO at Gillette. He led the digital transformation there after the merger of them and Procter & Gamble, and worked for Procter & Gamble for I think 24 years, 27 years, something like that. I don't remember. We talk about it in the episode, so stay tuned, listen to it, check it out. But he's the author of a book called Why Digital Transformations Fail that goes live on the 23rd of July. We got an advanced copy. I checked it out. It was awesome. Really enjoyed reading it. We've talked a lot about digital transformation on this podcast recently, and this is kind of the next step in what we've been talking about. He goes into some of the key things that technology leaders need to do when they're going through digital transformation, and some of the things that cause digital transformations to fail in other companies. Lots of good examples, and overall, it's a great read. Highly recommend it. So with all that being said, give it up for Tony Saldanha. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, we've got Tony Saldanha. He's the president of Transformant, and he wrote a new book that's called Why Digital Transformation Fail. And this book was important to me. I just got it. I consumed it. I read it, and I finished it up this weekend. And my company's been going through a digital transformation, so it's been super I guess, uplifting and exciting to hear about this. So, Tony, if you don't mind, telling the audience a little bit about how you got started in technology and how your career has taken you and where you are today, just to give us some context as we get into our conversation.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you, John, for having me on your show. I've been in the IT world for about 34 years now, 27 with Procter & Gamble. Not that I thought I would last in the IT world that long when I started. My education was actually in marketing and in finance. But I had the opportunity of essentially growing up with the industry. I was the first person to actually set up an offshore shared services center in the Philippines in 1993. And then also leading the outsourcing of about two-thirds of P&G's IT and shared services in 2003. And then acquisitions and divestitures, including Gillette in 2005. And I ended up leading shared services and the IT organization, which is a multi-billion-dollar entity at Procter & Gamble in every region of the world. So that's given me a really ringside view to the industry. So I have retired recently, about a year ago, from Procter & Gamble, and decided to, do some of this transformation beyond Procter & Gamble, and that's what the company Transformant is all about. Okay, so
when you were working at Procter & Gamble, when you guys kind of went through this digital transformation, what was that like? Like, what was it? What was the feeling like? Why did you feel like you needed to do something different? What was the motivation to transforming, to digital?
Yes, that's a great question, John. One of the things I've learned through this entire journey is that digital transformation is not a one-time project. It's a continuous iteration. It's a continuous evolution. So let me give you an example of that in the work that I did in the last 3 years at Procter & Gamble. Snapshot at that point in time, Procter & Gamble's IT and global business services was acknowledged to be best in class in the industry. So by all metrics, spending in terms of service levels compared to other large companies, our metrics were best in class, right? The ironic problem that we were faced with at that point in time was, okay, what's next? Because we know that in this world, you cannot rest on your laurels. And that's what led me to say, let's create an industry ecosystem to discover the next S-curve, the next evolution of the IT and shared services industry itself, right? And that's what got us into all kinds of questions, such as, should you use artificial intelligence to do real-time supply chain planning instead of what the world uses, which is the typical MRP2 process of supply chain planning, or even closer to home for most people. In today's world, should you even have a travel and expense system because, there's so much data that you actually shouldn't be putting your employees through creating another expense report. So those are the type of questions that we kind of got into.
Fascinating. Yeah. So what is it like when, you guys decide you're going to do something like this? What's the first step when it comes to getting people on board that may or may not see the need for it? There's always that thing, well, if it's not broke, why aren't we fixing it?
Yes. And that's, you hit upon what I believe is the number one issue for most organizations, which is, creating the case for change and a coalition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I learned through my journey, and I kind of talk about that in the book on why digital transformations fail, is that you have to declare top down that you're going to be in a journey of constant change. So at Procter & Gamble, what we did was we said, hey, let's learn from the best. And Google is one that, everybody should look at in terms of how do you constantly disrupt yourself. Google has this a framework which is called 70-20-10. So 70% of the resources in any, enterprise at Google is dedicated to running day-to-day operations. The 20 is constant, continuous improvement, and 10% is disrupt yourself, right? And so once you actually declare that, this is always going to happen, you take away some of the one-time fear, when you describe a big project and say, guys, come together, we're going to disrupt yourself and change your jobs, right? So that's, step number one. Step number two is to identify some of the most biggest influences in the organization and put them actually in charge of the change. I mean, the mistake most companies make is that they get innovators and, put them in Silicon Valley and say, you guys are going to help us change the way we operate. The problem with that is the day-to-day people that run the operation then say, okay, so this is not the problem that we need to deal with. We'll let the, innovators in the ivory tower deal with it, right? So the second thing you really have to do is make it real to the people that run the day-to-day operations. Because if they say, hey, we actually can dramatically change the way they operate, they bring the organization along with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally get that, because I've seen, at our company, we've been going under an official digital transformation initiative for probably about 18 months now. And it started out with kind of a push from IT, moving the business along. And then it really didn't pick up any steam or move the needle until we had the business themselves coming back to IT, kind of driving the force. Right. Is that kind of a commonplace thing that you see with companies that are going through something like this?
Very much. That's actually understandable because, just like, I don't know if you remember, but, when this whole internet and online thing became big in the 90s, typically within the enterprises, it started with IT saying, hey, we got to do things like email and we got to do things like e-commerce. And that didn't go anywhere until it became mainstream. So that is absolutely true. It's really important for most companies, starting at the board of directors and the CEO, CXO level, to understand that digital transformation is a corporate strategy, not a digital strategy, right? And it may sound like semantics, but it's not. There is a big difference between a company strategy on which markets do you want to be in, how do we want to sell, and what are the products, and then using digital as an enabler, as opposed to thinking of digital as a technology, and then asking yourselves, what can we do with the technology? And that's one of the reasons why I like to use the analogy of, the industrial revolutions, because that's essentially what's happening. We're in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, you've heard, John, of all of the examples of, when electricity became big in the manufacturing industry, they had to actually change the way the machines were laid out, because previously used to have the machines run around the central spindle and a belt which ran the machines, and that changed the layout of the whole factory floor itself. And you can only do that if you look at electricity in that case and digital in today's world as a horizontal enabler of everything that happens in the company.
No, yeah, I totally get that. So when it becomes a company-wide initiative and it's kind of pushed down, how do leaders, they rarely even have the time to get their own job done today without, working after hours. How do you get them to free up resources and time to go through something like this?
That's the number one issue for most leaders that I've had the opportunity to work with in my consulting job. And I think that's a very real challenge. Hey, look, I mean, the reality is that, dealing with this transformation is no longer an option in the sense that people cannot avoid it, right? So this is where I kind of go back to my own experience over the last few years at Procter & Gamble, and then also the Google framework of 70-20-10. So my recommendation is that the overall strategy of the organization has to incorporate an element of disruption. And that is what allows you to then say, I'm going to just make this part of my routine, as opposed to, have somebody else deal with it. I'm going to delegate it. That's just not possible. I wish I had a better answer than just, carve out 10% of your capacity and just do it. But I really cannot. I think it's an imperative. I don't think people can avoid it anymore.
Yeah, and I think people can do it too. I mean, when I look at time management, just in general, if let's say we all have families, we have things that are going outside of work, and people sometimes have to leave work early. They have to miss a couple hours. Do they not get their work done, or no? Yeah, we always find a way to still get that stuff done. It's just a matter of prioritization, and I think we could do the same with digital transformation as well.
I believe so, and when we actually started to look at it that way. It was amazing on just how much you could do with a little bit of capacity. So, just to kind of give you an example of what we were able to do with this group that I created called Next Generation Services while at Procter & Gamble. I created an ecosystem with a hand-picked, 10 to 15 people out of P&G's IT and shared services. Now, for context, we have about 5,000 people, so you can very easily pick 10 to 15. And you can, as you said, prioritize and make that possible, right? The second thing I did was I went to all of the big IT providers and said, hey, what we're going to do is find a way to do a 10x, so 10 times the change, 10 times improvement on payroll and planning and, accounting and things like that. If you want to be a part of that, you guys just, give me, one person each, full-time dedicated, and put them into our organization. And then we reached out to the venture capitalists, the top 10 VCs, the Andreessen and others, and, made a similar pitch, which is, you have thousands of startups who want to get a foothold into large companies. Why don't you connect them to us? And then once you basically put that ecosystem together, you have to find ways to make this win-win. So, I went to the IT companies and said, for example, I'm going to find out what is a 10 times better way to do travel and expenses. We will use our P&G people to make the design, but I want you to develop the software free of cost to me. But if you're successful, I will actually give you the code and the intellectual property to sell elsewhere, right? And you will use the best ideas in the world from the startups. And so once you're going to get an ecosystem going, it's amazing how much you can do with very little because, everybody has a win-win role in that forum.
Yeah, I like that idea too of bringing in people that have that expertise kind of, and they get something out of it too. You get the software, you get the innovation that's created for you specifically, but yet they can go take that information and rebrand it and sell it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, in your book, you talk about this being the fourth industrial revolution. What were the last three, and kind of what is this really about, and how big do you see this move to digital being, and how much of a disruptor is this actually going to be?
Yeah, actually, it's funny about the fourth industrial revolution. When I first heard the term, a few years ago, I was like, well, wait a minute. I remember going to school and hearing about the Industrial Revolution. What happened to the next, two in between?
Me too.
So in any case, I guess going by the latest tagging there, the first Industrial Revolution was, the mechanical the mechanical to steam and other stuff, right? So that's when steam became a big thing, and people and jobs moved from villages, and that's what we all heard about and read about, right? The second was actually in the early 1900s, when electricity and the availability of the internal combustion engines basically took off, right? And that's what drove, obviously, the whole automobile industry and airlines and things like that. The third was actually the birth of the internet in the 80s and 90s, and everything that's been made possible. The fourth industrial revolution is actually fascinating because it's the first time that you have the physical, the biological, and the digital all merging into each other to create completely new business models. So, for example, the fact that you can have a Star Trek-like tricorder where you can scan yourself and use a combination of biological information and stats about your heart rate and others to diagnose results of your body. That's the merging of the digital and biological, and the same with the Internet of Things and so on and so forth, right? It is incredibly disruptive. We've all heard of the typical examples of media industry and so on and so forth. But the retail apocalypse, and I write about that in the book, the fact that name after name, Sears, Macy's, and many of the iconic names are now under pressure. You see that also happening in other industries, manufacturing industry, real estate, and in areas that you never really thought possible. I'll give you one quick example. The legal industry. So recently I was invited to Mexico City to talk about this to their legal association. The fact of the matter is that now you have artificial intelligence being used in Chinese courts to, not just, digitize information that gets placed into the court, but also to help judges figure out, based on precedent, what to do and how to think about some of these cases. So it is everywhere, and it's going to be incredibly disruptive, just like the previous industrial revolutions were.
Yeah, I can definitely see it from a legal standpoint. When you look at the contracts and things that come in, being able to scan those and, obviously AI can read that much faster than a human and see things that are, possibly against policy or against procedures or violating something or, not quite the terms that you had originally entered in as part of the criteria requirements for that. I definitely see that, maybe even for real estate closings and such.
Yes. Real estate, the funny thing is all of these technologies provide organizations and governments an opportunity to leapfrog. So in real estate, some of the use cases that we're seeing based on blockchain in places like Africa and India are absolutely fascinating, because what it allows you to do is to essentially get into the area of document records, right? Mm-hmm. Historical records, especially in countries that weren't very good at records management, is a mess. And to be able to then decentralize it and say, hey, at the record registry, at the personal, document management, let's put all of that on blockchain. And let's allow complete transparency. So you take out the middlemen and you take out corruption. That's become such a big area of disruption. And that's great. I mean, I think that's what technology should be doing.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's fascinating when it comes into industries like that. But also when you think about future planning too, for city planning. And I heard something recently about Toronto, trying to becoming a smart city and bringing Google in there to do some future planning. Do you see AI and blockchain and things like that actually moving the needle when it comes to government and enterprise work?
It is. Latvia, Lithuania, and places like Singapore are on the forefront of using AI in government. So some of the examples that I was giving on legal in China, you have the same thing happening in, Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. They've started to use, I think this is in Estonia, blockchain as a way to do voting, right? So this is like people government type of voting, right? And I think the ability to basically take away what used to be historically painful processes, like applying for a driver's license or getting licenses to open a business. I mean, that has become quite literally real time in countries like Singapore. And so digital governance, not just in terms of record keeping, by the way, smart cities is such a big opportunity. The government of India has a plan to have 100 smart cities where you can take IoT sensor information from, not just cars and traffic, but also, pollution and registry and, people location and, all that kind of stuff, and use it for emergencies. That is such a big opportunity. Another small example of that in government and policing, I came across a tweet a few months ago from the city of Cincinnati, which is where I live, that talked about, how there was a shooting in a particular locality of Cincinnati, but they were able to pinpoint it by using a technology called Spot Shotter, which triangulates in real time from audio whenever a shot is fired in the city, and uses AI to redirect police to that location in real time. So these are just examples of how governments and cities are getting very smart about the use of technology.
Well, was it detecting by audio, or was it video? How was it triangulating where the shots came from?
Oh, yeah. So in the case of ShotSpotter, it basically triangulates from audio. But then when they need to basically triangulate to an accuracy of about 3 square meters, because you have to know exactly what corner of the street the actual shot came from, so you're targeting the right people there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's amazing the accuracy of some of these things these days.
So in your book, you kind of mentioned something that you kind of talked about how at one point you met with somebody about blockchain and then stepped back for a few months and then came back and was shocked about all the advancements that had gone on throughout blockchain. Is that, in that experience, you kind of talked about it as being something that, I was, struggling keeping current with something like that, and I found out that I needed to do a better job of that. Is that common when it comes to leaders if they've moved up in, let's say you went from a software developer to a manager to a VP of technology? Is that something you see as a common trend? The higher up you go in the organization, the further you kind of step away from the current technologies?
Yeah, it is certainly true. The higher you move up the organization, the more disconnected you can get from technology. And it's also true that the pace of change of technology is such that, even if you're away from a particular topic, in this particular case, as you correctly point out, about 4 years ago, I'd gotten an update on blockchain, which was just evolving. And then 3 months later, and I filed it away as, hey, this is interesting. I've got to keep an eye on it because this could be disruptive. But there are no use cases that I can use at Procter & Gamble. And 3 months later, when I went back, there were like literally dozens of use cases. So it's a real problem. All of the executives that I've worked with and I've spoken with call that out as a real challenge. And that's on top of the issue of digital literacy, where people who don't come from a digital background, can't keep up with really technical terms like blockchain being thrown around, right? Mm-hmm. And so in my book, I talk about how you actually have to be very diligent, both at a company and at an individual level, to create a plan to deal with it. Otherwise, the longer you wait, the harder it becomes.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I've noticed it even with myself that I've kind of, as I step back from some of the day-to-day, I kind of lose track of something. I have to be very intentional about staying on top of it, and that's where podcasts have kind of been very helpful for me, and audiobooks as well, staying intentional about keeping up with what's going on, what is some of the news on tech and the technologies that are out there, especially with cybersecurity and all the things that are going on and changing there as well. What other tips or advice do you have for someone on how to keep current, even though their day job may be full?
I actually think, you've already given a few good ideas. I'm going to elaborate on them. One is using new media. I think podcasts are an exploding medium today. I was just talking with somebody a few minutes earlier today, and she was saying how, she uses podcasts and other news radio while she's jogging in the morning as a way to kind of, come up to speed on what's been happening, right? So instead of jogging being a dead time from a learning perspective, it can become a really, really important time. The other set of tips that I like to provide people is to leverage the resources that you have around you. So, for example, I love the opportunity of reverse mentoring. Many of the young millennials who are much better and much faster at learning on some of these technical capabilities, even setting up, a monthly lunch with some of them is a great way for you to help them on other stuff, so mentoring and career while learning at the same time. Another great tip is to schedule trips, learning trips. So while I was at Procter & Gamble, we made it a routine in my leadership to actually go once a year and spend a week with venture capitalists and startups, right? And I think that's no longer an optional learning mechanism for many leaders. So you have to, as we were saying earlier, you have to make time and schedule some of these activities as a way to keep up.
I think that field trips, to the idea of taking a trip somewhere and immersing yourself is extremely crucial. And it's one of the things that I actually started doing. I found out about it on accident. One of my team members went and he did a ride along with someone, and just the amount of information that we learned by going somewhere else and getting kind of outside of our world and our little bubble and our echo chamber and hearing what some other people are doing just made such a huge impact on it kind of refreshed you as one thing, but it also gave you these ideas that you thought, I could apply that here and there, and things that you never really thought about, and you wouldn't have even been a project or come to mind as a way to transform or improve your business until you saw it somewhere else.
Yes, and interestingly, the most disruptive ideas actually come from applying something that you came across in a totally different context, to your specific problems. An anecdote that I love to share is, from the time, there was this big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the BP oil spill, if you guys remember, from about 10 years ago. And, that was unprecedented. How do you plug an oil spill at the bottom of the ocean, really, really deep down? And nobody had the answer. So they set up what is called an X Prize challenge, where you invite ideas from across the world, and you basically say, we're going to give the prize-winning idea, some money, like $1 million. And that's being used to great effect to solve the world's problems. But in this case, the company that won it was a small company. And I've heard that the two specific people in that company that came up with the idea, one of them was a dentist, the other one was a tattoo artist, right? So nobody from an oil background, and certainly nobody from a how do you plug an oil fire background, but from totally different industries that somehow obviously knew something about, fluid mechanics or fluid dynamics that helped them in this case.
Wow, that's that's crazy how a tattoo artist would come up with the idea to help fix the oil spill. But yeah, I can totally see it because I've seen it in different industries and different ideas out there where you bring someone from somewhere else and says, oh, why don't you just do it this way? And because I never thought about doing it that way. Kind of like Elon Musk with Tesla, just design the car from the ground up in a totally different way.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So when you go through, you talk about digital transformation 5.0, and you talk about the companies that are kind of moving the needle and becoming like a total transformative company. What are some examples of that we see today that are out there that have really, embraced transformation from the top down?
Not surprisingly, there are innovative companies where digital transformation is kind of baked into their philosophy, and I've been doing this over and over again. So I'm going to, since I've used Procter & Gamble previously as example, I'm going to kind of stay away from them just for a second and give other examples. One of the best companies that I love to use as an example is Adobe in the way they bake constant improvement in everything that they do. Another example is, I mentioned them in the book as well, the Virgin Group. But there are many, many other smaller companies who do things dramatically differently using a digital background and a digital backbone. So Zara, which is a fashion retailer, basically can go from designing a piece of clothing as fashion accessory into essentially having that product available in store, sold in 2 weeks. Right?
Wow.
That's an example of how the whole supply chain is completely crashed in terms of agility by using digital technologies. And there's many, many companies. And what they do is they basically look at a problem from the user or the consumer perspective. And then they say, hey, if I were to solve that problem in today's world, how would I do it? Most companies, actually solve the problem differently. They start from the perspective of continuous improvement. So they might actually map all of the 100 steps that are required to do design and manufacturing and logistics and retailing, and then say, can I use Six Sigma to improve that, right? Or, other technologies, right? And that's a big difference. You really have to look at the problem from the user outside and say, how would I solve that problem in today's world? And once you do that, you get major improvements, as I said, as with Zara.
So one thing I wanted to hit on and ask you about, I know a lot of the book concept is kind of directed towards the C-level executives and the CIOs and COOs and CDOs and things like that. But a large portion of our audience, although we do have some C-level executives listening for sure that responded to our survey we did about, I guess it's been almost 9 months ago now, but the largest portion of our audience are like middle managers or team leads or software development managers and leaders. Is there a way that they can use digital transformation concepts and ideas to transform their own teams and their own environments and their small on a smaller scale, maybe a macro scale, that can help them I guess become more efficient and develop products and be more innovative on a smaller scale?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually funny when the book does talk about digital strategy, for 2 or 3 of the 10, I guess, disciplines that I mentioned. But my target audience is actually across the board. C-suite, middle management, even people that are, just starting off in their career. Here are a few tips that I share in the book as well. The most important one, I think, for most people who are new to their career or in the middle stages of their career, is about how do you solve problems with the outcome in mind, right? And I just gave the example of Zara. And that's something that, I think is applied to very specific projects. I'll give you an example. If you look at something as mundane as travel and expense reporting systems, there are many startups and even large companies like Adobe that I I know of that actually don't have travel and expenses as a system, because in today's world, there's more than enough data out there to basically manage this as a money question rather than a documents question. What do I mean by that? So traditionally in today's world, if you're making a trip, your travel agency helps you with the booking, you save all of the receipts, you write an expense report, so on and so forth. Many of these companies do it differently. If you want to go from London to New York, you go into the system spits out a budget number, and then you're completely free at that point in time, in the sense that you can book wherever you want, you can stay wherever you want. All of your transactions, if you use a corporate credit card, are already there, and so you can validate them. There's no point writing an expense report. And by freeing up the employees, you're getting the best creativity out of them. Right? So this is an example of an idea that can be applied to a project at the middle management level. Right? The many examples that I give of agile development, iterative, creating of products is again very, very important, I think, at the middle management level. Digital literacy is a thing that I talk about that I think at the entry level and the middle management level is very, very important in today's world, right? And so if I were to kind of step back and kind of give a couple of ideas to people outside of the senior management level, the first thing I would say is that, keep in mind that everybody is a disruptor, either at the individual level or at the middle management level, right? You have to figure out what's the 10% of your capacity that you're going to make time for to change the way you do your current piece of work. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is that, think about ecosystems rather than your own resources as being your enabler. So even at the middle management level, you have suppliers that work for you that are available to be challenged, or at least part of their capacity to come up with disruptive ideas, or people down the organization. We have a lot of passion, but don't have the forum to kind of play out their ideas. So those are a few thoughts that might be useful to people.
No, I think it's great ideas. I think definitely looking at your vendors and your suppliers and such as a leveraging tool. I know at a previous company we used that as a way to get free training, to bring in those vendors in and say, hey, like, we've been a loyal customer of yours for X number of years. We want to continue to use this product, but in order to get the most out of it, we want to find out some of your new features. We want to be a partner with you guys. How can you train our employees so that we get the most out of these products, so that it becomes beneficial for us, so we can keep you on as a vendor? And that's been very helpful in the past.
Yeah, I did something similar at one of my previous assignments. I mean, if you give your vendors the opportunity, kind of line them up once a month and say, hey, you can come in and ahead of time, let's make a list of disruptive technologies or new capabilities or other stuff. And, you guys get half an hour to present to us, right? It's such a win-win idea. I mean, they have the opportunity to kind of position themselves as a leading-edge thinker in, a leading-edge area. And you guys get the benefit of essentially learning something new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This has been a great conversation. Is there anything else that you would like to add when it comes to leadership in general, and maybe some advice that you would have for upcoming leaders out in the technology community?
So if I may, leave a couple of tips behind. The first thing I would say is that, this coming digital transformation, or digital disruption rather, is an opportunity of absolutely historical proportions, right? And just as it has in prior industrial revolution, fortune, favors the brave, but also fortune favors the prepared, right? So have a plan, create a plan as part of your business strategy to deal with it. So that would be the first thing I would tell leaders. The second thing I would share with leaders and the broader organization is that you have more resources at your fingertips than you might imagine if you put the entire ecosystem to work, right? And so the the challenge which all of us face on how to prioritize time away from day-to-day operations is a challenge that everybody faces. Elon Musk has that. Jeff Bezos has that. Some of the best disruptors that I know about have that too, right? Mm-hmm. So part of this is basically just being disciplined to create the 10% capacity to do that. And then the final thing, which is essentially the whole premise of my book, is that the reason why most digital transformations fail is actually neither technology nor is it innovation. It is essentially following a very disciplined checklist of, you've got to create the business strategy first before you do anything else. You have to have the right people within your organization engaged. You have to follow the right processes for execution. And the book has more detailed checklists there. So that would be maybe the third and final part that I would have to offer.
Yeah, that's really good. And I really like the way in your book you talked about how you got the idea of checklists actually from airplanes. You mentioned that you're an airplane nerd. What got you hooked on airplanes?
Oh, this is something that's been there. Ever since I was a kid. Most kids grow out of it. I never did. So I just am fascinated by that. And the connections between digital transformation and airplanes for our listeners is that, as I've been doing this digital transformation thing over and over again, what struck me is that, there is a set of learnings that most successful digital transformation organizations and leaders have come into. It's just amazing that, we just recreate that list every time we do a transformation. And so both for myself and for my people, I started to put that checklist together. And that this is really, where the aha happened to me. As I was looking at that checklist, and I was comparing that with a checklist of what airplane pilots use as part of their pre-flight takeoff and, in-flight checklist, it seemed to me that there were many concepts there that were applicable, right? And so that's what's led me to say, there are these 10 disciplines, and then, there's a series of checklists. I provide some examples in the book that can be followed to improve the success rate of digital transformations.
Yeah, and the book is Why Digital Transformations Fail, and I believe the hardcover comes out next week, July 23rd.
It does. Almost, yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for the advanced copy. I really appreciate it. I thought it was a fantastic book. I went ahead and picked up the audiobook as well because it's available now. If anybody wants to link on over to that, I'll have that linked in the show notes at ageekleader.com, and they can check out the audiobook and the Kindle version. The hardcover will be shipping next week. How else can people find you or connect with you online or on social media?
I am on LinkedIn's been my most responsive media. But in addition to that, www.transformant.io, so that's the word transform and then the insect ant put together as one word, .io, India Oscar, or www.whydigitaltransformationsfail.com.
All right, I'll link those up in the show notes, and as well as a tag over to your LinkedIn and link up the book for sure. I really appreciate having you on. I really appreciate the book. It's been helpful for me as my company's going through this, and hopefully it'll be helpful for many of our listeners out there as well.
Hey, John, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Tony Saldanha. And before I let you go, I want to read one review that we got. This was from Victor Bihoka. Hope I said that right. And it just said, this podcast is full of useful stuff for geeks with a mix of techniques and tips for leaders. So thank you for that rating and review. Greatly appreciate it. I'll go ahead and read one more. This one's from Johnny BBMA, and it says, so far so great. I have listened to all episodes, and each episode is worth a lesson. Got so many great leadership tips. So thank you guys for those reviews. And if you don't mind, head on over to iTunes. If you haven't left me a rating and review, please do so. Greatly appreciate it, and we'll read them on the show. All right, awesome. Have a good week.